The folding chairs were still warm from the sun when the speakers along Commerce Street stopped playing music. I noticed it before anyone else at our row did, because I'd spent 22 years listening to public address systems for a living, and I knew the difference between a song ending and a feed being killed. A song fades, the engineer rides the fader down, or the track runs out, and there's a tail to it, a softening. A feed dies all at once, with that small electric thud that travels down the wire and pops out of every cone at the same instant, a sound like a fist hitting a pillow somewhere far away. The whole block went quiet in a single beat. The gospel choir that had been warming up near the courthouse steps trailed off because they heard it too, their voices snagging on the silence, and a trumpet player lowered his horn and looked up at the nearest pole the way you look up when a light burns out over your head. My daughter Renee tugged my sleeve and asked why the music stopped. I told her the truth, which is that I didn't know yet. My wife, Carol, was unfolding the paper fans the church had handed out, the ones with the picture of the old freedom marchers on the back. Men and women in their Sunday clothes walking arm in arm down some other street in some other June, and she kept fanning even as she looked up at the speaker bolted to the lamppost above us. The heat that morning was the wet, heavy kind that sits on your skin like a second shirt. The kind of June heat that makes the asphalt smell like tar and the whole city feel slowed down, half asleep, dreaming. Then a voice came through. Not a person. The flat, synthetic cadence of the emergency alert system. The one everybody has heard 100 times for tornado tests and never once believed. There's a particular ugliness to that voice, a deadness in how it joins one word to the next, like a thing reading a language it doesn't speak. Except this time, it didn't say test. It said the parade is canceled. It said return to your homes. It said shelter and remain indoors and do not approach anyone exhibiting. And then the word it used cut off mid-syllable, like somebody yanked the script out of the machine's mouth. And the speaker hissed empty air. 3,000 people on a closed-off street, and not one of them moved for about 4 seconds. Before I take you any further into that morning, let me say something plain. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to these stories. And if this is your first time sitting with me, you're welcome here too. If this kind of grounded survival story is your thing, stay with the channel and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let me get back to Commerce Street, because those 4 seconds were the last quiet ones we got. My name is Marcus Webb. I was 51 years old that June, and for most of my working life, I'd been a stage and event sound engineer, which is a fancy way of saying I was the man you never saw who made sure the mayor's microphone worked and the band didn't blow the breakers. I'd done that parade for 9 years running. I knew the route. I knew where the power drops were. I knew which lamppost speakers buzzed when the humidity got high, and which ones cut out if a kid leaned on the junction box at the corner of 4th. I knew the man who ran the city's emergency siren network because we'd shared a beer after enough city council meetings to call each other by first name. His name was Hollis, a big, soft-spoken man who kept peppermints in his shirt pocket. And the reason I tell you that now is that Hollis was the only person I could think of in that frozen moment who would know what the broadcast meant. Because the broadcast had come through the city's own siren array. The same array Hollis babied like it was his own children, and that array did not turn on by accident. It took a deliberate hand. A key turned. A code entered. Somebody had decided to use it. Somebody had decided this was the day. We'd brought folding chairs because Carol's knees were bad, the cartilage in them worn down to almost nothing after 30 years on her feet teaching 2nd grade. And Renee, who was 11, liked to sit up front where she could see the horses. We had a small cooler with cut watermelon and 2 bottles of water and a thermos of coffee I'd already half finished, the coffee gone lukewarm and bitter in the heat. We had sunscreen and the church fans and a phone each, and that was the whole inventory of what we carried into the worst day of our lives. I want you to hold on to that, because everything that happened after came down to what was in reach and what wasn't. You don't get to choose your supplies when the world ends. You get whatever you happen to bring to a parade. The synthetic voice came again, looping. But it was wrong now. It started the message, got 3 words in, and reset. Started, reset. Like the machine running it had been knocked off its rails and was trying to find the top of the page again. Stuttering, a needle skipping back over the same scratched groove. The crowd noise that rose up around us wasn't panic yet. It was the low, confused murmur of a lot of people all asking the same question to whoever stood next to them, the sound a stadium makes when the lights flicker. A man in a Shriner's hat near the curb, red felt with a gold tassel, laughed and said it was probably a glitch. The city couldn't run a stoplight right. A few people laughed with him, grateful for the permission to. Carol didn't. Carol was watching me, and I was watching the far end of the street, north, toward the medical district, because that's where the wind was coming from, carrying the smell of horses and fried dough down to us, and that's where I'd started to hear something underneath the murmur. It was a car horn. One long, unbroken note, the kind that only happens when a person is slumped against the wheel or pressing it on purpose and not letting go. It came from maybe 6 blocks up, past the point where the police had set their barricades. And then there was a second horn, closer, and the sound of metal hitting metal, that flat crunch of a low-speed collision, glass tinkling after it, and a woman's scream that didn't stop the way a startled scream stops. It kept going. It went up and stayed up. And there was a quality to it I had no name for then. A raw, bottomless quality. The sound a person makes when they have stopped being embarrassed about making noise. I stood. I told Carol to fold the chairs. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew the shape of it. I'd worked enough crowds to feel the moment when a gathering stops being a crowd and starts being a stampede in waiting. The way the energy changes, the way people stop talking and start glancing at exits. And we were maybe 90 seconds from that moment. 3,000 people on a street with 8 exits, most of them blocked by parade barricades and parked floats and the long flatbed trailers the Rotary Club had decked out in crepe paper. If everyone broke at once, the people who'd go down first would be the small ones and the slow ones. And I had one of each standing right next to me, and a stampede doesn't care who you love. Renee asked again, quieter this time, what was happening. And I could hear the wobble starting in her voice. I crouched so I was at her eye level, down where I could see the freckles across her nose and the sweat at her hairline. And I told her we were going to take a little walk back to the truck, and that she was going to hold my belt and not let go no matter what, and that her job, her only job, was to keep holding on. Kids do better with a job than with reassurance. Reassurance they can see through, but a job they can do. I'd learned that the hard way years before, when she got separated from us at a county fair, and I found her 20 minutes later having a meltdown by the funnel cake stand. And I'd realized after that, a scared child needs a task to hold on to more than she needs to be told everything's fine. It held true that morning. She grabbed my belt with both hands, knuckles going pale, and set her jaw the way she did over math homework. Carol had the chairs folded and slung over her shoulder by their nylon strap, and I almost told her to leave them. And I'm glad now I didn't, because those 2 aluminum chairs ended up mattering more than I could have guessed. We started moving south, against the grain of a crowd that hadn't decided which way to break. And that was the only reason we got anywhere. We were moving before the herd. Everyone else was still in that suspended second where the brain refuses the evidence, where a man tells himself it's a glitch and a wreck and somebody else's emergency. We were already walking. We made it maybe 1 block before the first runner came past us going the wrong way. A young man, college age maybe, in a green t-shirt, sprinting north toward the screaming against all sense. His face wasn't scared. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that finally turned the cold key in my stomach. His face was empty, slack, mouth hanging open, eyes fixed on nothing. And there was dark wet down the front of his shirt that wasn't sweat, too dark, gone almost black in the creases. He clipped Carol's shoulder hard enough to spin her, hard enough that I heard the breath go out of her, and kept going without breaking stride, without a word, without so much as a flicker of registering she was there, like she was a turnstile. I caught her before she went down, got my arm around her waist, and hauled her upright. Renee never let go of my belt. I felt her small fists tighten as her mother stumbled, but she held on, doing her job. I want to be careful here, because I'm not going to pretend I understood any of it that morning. I didn't. I'd heard the broadcast say the word that got cut off, and my mind was already trying to finish it. Turning it over the way your tongue worries a chipped tooth, and the finish my mind landed on was a word no sound engineer or church deacon or anybody in that crowd was prepared to say out loud. I pushed it down. I told myself the man was on something, some drug I didn't have a name for, the kind that takes the person out and leaves the body running. I told myself the horns were a wreck, and the screaming was the wreck, somebody pinned and hurt. I told myself a lot of comfortable things in the space of 1 block, lining them up like sandbags against a flood, and every one of them washed away when we reached the corner of Commerce and 3rd. There was a police officer there, one of the ones who'd been working the barricade, a big man, his hat knocked off. And lying upside down in the gutter a few feet from him, he was on the ground. 2 people were on top of him, and they were not helping him. And the sounds they were making and the sounds he was making did not go together in any world I'd lived in until that morning. I'm going to leave the details of that there, because Renee was right beside me, and I put my hand on the side of her face and turned her into my hip, pressed her face against my belt so she couldn't see, and kept walking, faster now. And I made the decision in that instant that I would not look directly at anything I didn't have to look at. Because a man can only carry so many pictures before he stops being able to function. And functioning was the only thing keeping my family alive. I have kept that rule since. There are things from those 4 days I made myself not see clearly, and I'm grateful for every one of them I succeeded at not seeing. We cut left, off Commerce, down the alley that ran behind the row of shops. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a delivery truck, and it stank of grease from the diner's exhaust vent and the sweet rot of a dumpster that hadn't been emptied. And it was empty. And empty was exactly what I wanted. The roar of the street was a wall to our right now, muffled by brick. And in the alley, I could hear my own breathing, ragged, and Carol's, and the scrape of the folding chairs against the wall when she misjudged the width in the dim light. The buildings rose 3 stories on either side and cut the alley into shade. And after the white glare of the street, it took my eyes a moment to adjust. And in that moment, I understood how blind we'd be every time we moved from light to dark. And I filed that away. Renee was crying without sound, just tears running clean tracks down her dusty face, still holding my belt, still doing her job. I told her she was doing perfect. I told her we were almost there. I lied to her, and I'd do it again. We were not almost there. We were 3 blocks from the truck, and the alley only ran 1 block before it dumped us out onto 3rd. And 3rd was where I'd seen the officer. I stopped at the mouth of the alley and held up my hand flat, the way you do on a job site to freeze a crew. And the 2 of them stopped behind me. I edged forward along the brick and looked. 3rd Street was a mess of stopped cars, some with doors hanging open, a minivan up on the sidewalk with its hazards still blinking out their patient orange rhythm into all that chaos. There were people moving between the cars, and from a distance at first, they looked like ordinary people, just walking. And that almost broke my caution, because walking is normal, walking is fine, walking is what people do. But I watched one of them for a few seconds, a heavyset man in a polo shirt, and the walk was wrong. It was the walk of a man who didn't know where his own legs were, lurching from car to car, listing to one side, stopping at each window like he was looking for something he couldn't name and would forget the moment he found it. And when a real person, a woman in a yellow sundress, came running out from behind a delivery van, every one of the walking figures turned toward her at the same time, all together, the heads coming around in one motion like iron filings turning to a magnet. And then they all started toward her. And the listing slow walk became something faster, hungrier. And the woman in yellow made the same bottomless sound I'd heard from up the street. That was when I understood, all the way down to the floor of myself, that the comfortable explanations were gone. Whatever was happening up the street had already gotten this far south. We weren't running ahead of it. We were running through it. It was around us. It had been around us, maybe, the whole time we'd been walking, and I'd been too busy lying to myself to see it. I pulled back into the alley, slow, no sudden movement, the way you back away from a dog you don't trust. My hands were steady, which surprised me. And I've thought about why since, lying awake on the north bank with the river sound coming through the window. And I think it's because the part of my brain that handles crises had finally taken the wheel from the part that handles fear. They're different parts. The fear part screams and freezes. The crisis part goes quiet and cold and starts counting. I was counting now. I was thinking about routes and distances and sight lines. The truck on Fulton was 3 blocks down and 1 over. And to get there on foot, we'd have to cross 3rd, which was full of them, or go around, which meant the long way down the alley system behind the buildings, more distance, more time, more dark passages to blind us. There was a 3rd option, and it was the one I took, and I've turned it over 1,000 times since, wondering if it was right. The hardware store, not my truck behind it, the store itself. Its back loading door led onto this same alley, 2 doors down, and I knew it would be unlocked because the owner, a man named Pell, always propped it during business hours for deliveries, jamming it with a brick because the spring closer was too stiff for his old hands. And I knew that even on a parade day, he'd have come in to mind the register because Pell didn't trust anybody else to count his drawer. A locked truck 3 blocks through a crowd of those things, or a building with walls and a steel door right here, 10 feet away. It wasn't really a choice. I made the call. I always make the call. That's both my strength and the thing that's cost me the most. And you'll see both sides of it before this is done. I got us to the loading door, moving low and quick along the wall, and it was propped, exactly as I'd known it would be, with a chunk of broken cinder block instead of the usual brick. I pulled it open, the steel heavy and reluctant, the hinges complaining. And I pushed Carol and Renee inside ahead of me into the dark, and followed them, and kicked the cinder block clear, and let the heavy door swing shut. The bar dropped into its bracket with a solid iron clunk that I felt in my teeth. The most beautiful sound I'd heard all morning. And the roar of the street went from a wall to a whisper. And from for the first time since the music died, I let myself take one full breath, all the way to the bottom of my lungs. The back room of the hardware store smelled like fertilizer and cut keys and machine oil. That particular mix that every old hardware store has. The smell of a place where men solve problems with their hands. It was dim, lit only by the gray light coming through a high, dirty window near the ceiling, and the green glow of an exit sign over the door we'd come through. Tall metal shelving ran in rows toward the front, stacked with boxes and bins and the patient inventory of 100 small repairs. And somewhere up there, a small radio was playing, tinny and faint. The kind of cheap transistor set an old man keeps on the counter for company. I knew that sound, Pell. I called his name, low, pitched under the radio, and the radio cut off mid-song and a voice answered from the dark up front, shaky, thin, asking who was there. I told him it was Marcus, the sound man, and that I had my wife and my little girl with me, and that the street was bad, real bad, and we needed to be inside. There was a long pause, and then Pell came out from between the rows, holding a framing hammer in both hands, like a man who'd never held one as a weapon in his life, and was discovering, in real time, that it didn't feel as good in his grip as he'd hoped. He was past 70, thin as a fence rail, with liver spots on his scalp and reading glasses pushed up on his bald head. And he was wearing the green apron he wore behind the counter. And the ordinariness of that apron in that moment nearly undid me. He looked at the three of us, at Renee's tear-streaked face and Carol's torn sleeve where the runner had clipped her. And he looked at the door I'd just barred behind us. And he lowered the hammer slow. And he said the thing that hung over everything that came after. He said his nephew had called him 20 minutes ago from the hospital before the broadcast and told him to lock the doors and not open them for anybody, no matter what they said, no matter who they looked like. And then the call had cut off, and Pell hadn't been able to reach him since. And he'd been standing in his own store for 20 minutes, not knowing whether to believe his own nephew. I asked him what the hospital had to do with it. Pell set the hammer down on the counter, careful, like it might go off, and rubbed his face with both hands. And when he took them away, he looked 10 years older than he had a second before. He said his nephew, Daniel, worked the ER, an orderly, had for years. He said they'd started getting people in around dawn, a few at first, then a dozen, then more than they had beds for, all with the same thing, a high fever and a bite, or a scratch they couldn't account for, didn't remember getting, agitated, combative, getting worse by the minute instead of better. He said the staff had been bitten trying to restrain them, because the sick ones didn't fight like sick people. They fought like animals, and that the bitten ones got sick fast, faster than anything should, fever to fighting in under an hour. And that by the time Daniel called, the ER doors were locked from the inside, and the people locked outside in the ambulance bay were not behaving like people who wanted help. They were behaving like the thing the staff had locked the doors against. And then the line went dead, and Pell had been dialing it every couple of minutes since. And it just rang. That was the first hard piece of information I had. And I held on to it like a man holds onto a railing in the dark, because in the days that came, it was the only thing close to a map. It spread by bite. It spread fast, faster than fast, an hour or less from wound to turning. And it had started 6 blocks north of where my daughter was now sitting on an overturned mop bucket in the back of a hardware store, hugging her own knees, her chin trembling. Carol asked the practical question, the one that made me love her more in that moment than I had in years. She didn't ask what was happening, or why, or whose fault it was, or whether God had finally lost patience with us. She asked Pell what he had in the store. Just that. What do you have? Because she'd already understood, the way I had, that the answer to the next several hours wasn't going to come from outside, wasn't going to come from the government or the hospital or the men with the sirens. It was going to come from these shelves, from the patient inventory of small repairs. And we needed to know what we were working with. I want to tell you what a hardware store has in it when the world ends outside its doors, because it's not what the movies show you. It doesn't have answers. It has rope, coils of it, nylon and natural fiber, and blue plastic tarps folded in their packages, and duct tape, the good cloth kind and the cheap kind, and box cutters and utility knives in a bin by the register, and a whole pegboard wall of hand tools, hammers and pry bars and wrenches, and lengths of PVC pipe standing in a barrel, and a rack of work gloves in every size, and a shelf of flashlights, and a bin of loose batteries that I went through almost immediately. On my knees, on the concrete, sorting them by size, because nothing in this world is more useless than 6 flashlights that all take a different battery. And I needed to know how many of mine would actually run. It has a propane rack chained up out back, and a generator on the floor display still in its box, too heavy and too loud to be any use to us. And it had a locked steel cabinet of long guns that Pell kept for the hunters in the county, along with maybe 4 boxes of shells stacked on top. And it had a hand crank emergency radio in the camping aisle, the kind with the little fold-out handle that charges itself off your own muscle, no batteries needed, the kind that survivalists buy and never use. I went to that radio the way a drowning man goes to a rope, because the broadcast was the thing eating at me, the word that got cut off, the question of who had turned the sirens on. And a radio was the one thing in this entire store that I actually knew how to make sing. Everything else was Pell's trade. The radio was mine. That radio became the center of the next 4 days. Everything that happened, every decision I made, good and bad, traced back to that little crank-powered receiver and what came out of it. So let me tell you about the first thing it gave us. I cranked it up while Carol got Renee settled on the moving blankets, and Pell went to make sure the front doors were locked, and the metal security gate was pulled down over the glass. The handle was stiff and the gearing whined, and I cranked it a full minute to get a charge, the cheap plastic warm in my hand. And then I found the local AM band first, out of habit, because that's where the emergency information lives. There was nothing there but the same EAS tone I'd heard out on the street, looping its broken message, the canceled parade and the shelter indoors, and the cutoff word, over and over, a machine talking to an empty city. So I kept turning the dial, slow, a hair at a time, the way you hunt when you know there's something out there to find. And somewhere down past the commercial stations, in the dead zone between a Spanish-language preacher still calmly delivering his Sunday sermon as if nothing was wrong, which was its own kind of horror, and a wide wash of static, I found a voice that did not belong on the public airwaves. It was a man, and he was reading numbers, not random numbers, a sequence slow and clear, the way you read coordinates or code over a radio, with the discipline of someone trained to it. And between the runs of numbers, he'd say a phrase that he repeated every single time, word for word. And the phrase was this: containment line holding at the river, containment line holding at the river. All units inside the line remain inside the line. Then more numbers. Then it would loop back and repeat. The same flat, measured voice, no fear in it, no haste. Just the awful patience of a recording or a man reading a card he'd read so many times the words had stopped meaning anything to him. I knew that voice was a problem before I fully understood why. Carol came over and crouched beside me and listened, her hand on my shoulder, and asked what it meant. And I told her the part I was sure of, which was that somebody official enough to have a transmitter and a script, and the discipline to read it, was talking about a containment line, and that we were currently south of the river. The river ran along the north edge of downtown. The Commerce Street Bridge the main way across. The hospital, the medical district, where this thing had started before dawn, was on our side of the river, their side. Whatever the line was holding back, it was holding it back on the wrong side, our side, with us inside it. Pell came back from the front, his footsteps slow, and he heard the last of the loop. And he said something that made my stomach drop through the concrete floor. He said the only river crossing for 2 miles in either direction was that Commerce Street Bridge. The old foot crossings were gone. The next vehicle bridge was clear out past the highway interchange. And he said that if they were holding a containment line at the river, the first thing they'd do, the very first thing any sane person would do, is close that bridge, which meant the one way out of downtown to the south, the way home, the way to anywhere that wasn't this, ran across a bridge that the people with the transmitter had every reason in the world to seal. We were not running ahead of the outbreak. And we were not just running through it. We were boxed inside it, sealed in a sector that the only organized authority left in the city had drawn a line around and decided to contain. Now, I'm going to tell you about the 4 days we spent in that store. But I'm not going to tell you they were 4 days of constant horror, because that's not how it went, and that's not what made it hard. What made it hard was the waiting and the deciding and the slow grinding pressure of not knowing whether the smartest thing was to stay still or to move. And the way every hour that passed without a decision was itself a kind of decision. The horror came in spikes, sharp and total, and then receded. The pressure never receded. The pressure was the air we breathed in that store. The first night, we didn't sleep, none of us. We sat in the back room with one flashlight on, pointed up at the ceiling so it bounced and lit the space without throwing a single beam out any window, and we listened to the city outside. The street out front never went quiet. It wasn't roaring anymore, the way it had been at the start, that mass panic sound of 3,000 people all breaking at once. It had settled into something worse, something sparser and more permanent. The sound of a city that had stopped being a city. A shuffle. A car alarm somewhere that ran down to nothing over the course of an hour. The battery dying by degrees. The whoops getting weaker and farther apart until they stopped. Glass breaking once, far off, a long collapsing crash. And under all of it, every so often, the sound I came to dread more than the screaming, which was a single, dragging footstep, then a long pause, then another, right outside the security gate, as something moved past the front of the store and stopped, and stood there, and I could feel it standing there through the wall, and then moved on. The first time it happened, Renee started to make a sound, just the beginning of a whimper, and Carol's hand came up gently over her mouth, and we all held still, every muscle, until the dragging started up again and faded north. After that, we didn't need to be told. We learned to freeze. We learned that those things hunted by sound, mostly, and maybe by movement glimpsed through glass, but mostly by sound. And we learned that Pell's store had a saving grace, which was the steady, low hum of a beverage cooler in the front, the kind that holds soda and bottled water, running off its own compressor, and as long as we stayed quieter than that hum, quieter than the building's own background noise, we were simply part of the building to them. Just another thing that hummed. The day we forgot that lesson is the day everything changed, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And I promised you the order of things. I spent most of that first night with the crank radio against my ear. The volume so low it was almost subvocal. Working the dial in increments so small my fingers cramped. Building a picture of the world outside the box, one fragment at a time. The numbers station with the containment line message was the strongest signal, and it never changed, never updated, just looped, which told me it was automated, or else a man reading the same card over and over because he had nothing new to say and had been ordered to keep saying it. But there were other things in the static if you were patient, if you were willing to sit in the dark with a plastic radio against your ear and listen to a dying city talk to itself. Fragments. A woman's voice, once, very faint, riding a frequency up high near the top of the band, saying she was on a rooftop on Magnolia Street with 3 children and asking over and over, in a voice trying so hard to stay calm, if anyone could hear her, if anyone was coming. And I couldn't answer her. The crank radio only received, it couldn't transmit. And that helplessness sat on my chest like a stone. Listening to a mother on a roof 3 miles away ask the dark for help I couldn't give. I went back to that frequency a dozen times over the next 4 days. I never heard her again. I think about her more than I should. And then, near 3 in the morning, with Carol and Renee finally fallen into a thin, uneasy sleep against each other on the moving blankets, and Pell dozing upright in the chair by the register, I caught something that changed the whole shape of my thinking. It was on a frequency close to the containment broadcast, almost overlapping it so that the two bled together. And it was a different man, talking faster, less scripted, no discipline in his voice at all, just exhaustion and strain. And he wasn't reading numbers. He was talking to someone, a back and forth, and I only ever caught his side of it. And what I caught was this. Negative. The south sector is not cleared. Repeat, the south sector is still hot. Do not move the line south of the river until sunrise. We don't have the people. We don't have the people to... And then it broke up into static and was gone. And I cranked the radio hard and chased the frequency, but it didn't come back. South sector, south of the river. That was us. That was the box we were sitting in. And the man on the radio had said the line wasn't moving south until sunrise because they didn't have the people. Which meant 2 things. And I sat in the dark and took both of them apart slowly. The way you take apart a problem you're afraid of. It meant that at sunrise, they intended to do something to the south sector. Move on it. Push the line into it. Something. And it meant that for now, in the dark, nobody official was coming for us. And nobody was going to. And the smartest and most organized and best informed people left in the city were treating our side of the river not as a place to be saved, but as a place to be contained. We were not citizens to them anymore. We were the thing inside the line. I sat with that until the gray light started to seep through the high, dirty window and turn the shelves from black shapes into gray ones. And when it did, I made my first real plan. And I made it because I'd understood something in the night that Pell and Carol hadn't fully grasped yet. Staying in the store was safe right up until the exact moment it wasn't. And the moment it stopped being safe would arrive without warning. All at once, the way the music had stopped. And when it did, we would want to already know exactly where we were going, because there would be no time to figure it out. A man who waits to decide until he's forced to decide has already lost. I'd built a career on that principle. You don't troubleshoot a dead microphone in front of 3,000 people. You've already got the backup run. You've already walked the failure points, so that when it goes wrong, you're not thinking, you're moving. So at first light, I took inventory like my life depended on it. Because it did. Because all our lives did. I found the gun cabinet key on a cup hook screwed under the lip of the register, right where Pell told me it'd be. and I unlocked the steel cabinet, the door swinging open with a screech I muffled with my hand. There were 2 pump shotguns, a bolt-action deer rifle, and the 4 boxes of shells, 2 of which were the right gauge for the shotguns, and 2 of which were rifle rounds we'd never use. I'm not a gunman. I'd hunted with my father as a boy, gone out into the cold woods before dawn a handful of times, and shot at almost nothing. But I remembered enough not to point one at my own family and to keep the safety on until I meant otherwise, and to expect the kick. I loaded 1 shotgun, thumbing the shells in until the tube was full, the brass cold and heavier than I remembered, and I racked one into the chamber and set the safety and set the gun aside. And I loaded the second one and left it for Pell. The rifle I left in the cabinet. Too slow, too much to think about. Then I filled a duffel bag from the camping aisle with the things that mattered, moving fast and quiet up and down the rows in the gray light. And I want to walk you through it because the contents of that bag were the difference between living and dying more than once. The crank radio first, my lifeline. The 2 flashlights that took the same size battery, and every battery of that size from the bin. A coil of paracord, a roll of the good cloth duct tape, 2 box cutters with fresh blades, work gloves for all 4 of us, sized as best I could guess. A first aid kit off the shelf, the camping kind, in a red nylon pouch. The pair of binoculars from the same camping display, which I almost left and then didn't. And thank God I didn't. And every bottle of water and every packet of food off the small snack rack by the register, the jerky and the peanut crackers and the dusty candy bars, sweeping the whole rack into the bag with my forearm. It wasn't much. A child's idea of provisions. But it was what there was. And I packed it tight and zipped it and set it by the back door, loaded and ready. And I made a rule for myself in that moment that the bag stayed packed and stayed by the door no matter what, that we were always 60 seconds from leaving. And that one rule is the reason there are 3 of us alive on the North Bank tonight instead of none. And then I did the thing that I think saved us, though it cost us too, the way most things that save you cost you. I went to the front of the store, staying low, below the level of the gate, and I found a gap where the security mesh didn't quite meet the door frame. And I put my eye to it, and I made myself look at the street in daylight. Because you cannot plan a route you have never seen. And I needed to see what we'd be walking through. Commerce Street in the gray early morning was a thing I will carry to my grave. The floats were all still there, abandoned mid-staging, the Rotary Club's flatbed with its crepe paper bunting gone limp in the humidity. The high school marching band's big bass drum lying on its side, in the middle of the road, with a long crack split across the head, where somebody had stepped clean through it running. Folding chairs everywhere, thousands of them, knocked over and scattered and tangled. And some of them, this is the part that still gets me. Some of them still standing upright in their neat rows. Perfect, waiting. Like the people had just stood up to stretch their legs and would be right back. The church fans were all over the ground, hundreds of them. The old freedom marchers face up in the dirt and the gutter, looking up at a sky that had gone the flat white of a coming hot day. And among all of it, moving slow, were the people who hadn't gotten out. I counted maybe 15 in the stretch of street I could see. Drifting, doing that wrong, lurching walk between the cars and the chairs. And I made myself watch them, made myself study them, because they were the problem I had to solve. And you don't solve a problem by looking away from it. Every now and then, 2 of them would drift close to each other and pause, heads turning, a flicker of attention, and then drift apart again, because they had no interest in one another. They only wanted what was warm and moving and made noise. They were sorting the world into pray and not pray, and each other was firmly in the not pray column. I watched them a long time, longer than was comfortable, with my knees aching on the concrete and the gun across my lap, and I learned their rules, and I'm going to give them to you the way I gave them to Carol. Because these rules are the spine of everything that happened after. They were slow and they had nothing to chase, slow and aimless. But they never rested, never sat, never stopped, just drifted and drifted on legs that should have given out. They turned toward sound fast, faster than their bodies could follow, the head snapping around on the neck while the body took an extra beat to catch up and start lurching after. They couldn't work a doorknob, couldn't manage the turn and pull, but they could shove through a door already standing ajar. And they would break glass if there was something warm and noisy on the other side, worth breaking it for. And they hunted in a loose, scattered way that turned dangerous the instant one of them locked solidly onto a target. Because the moment one fixed and committed and started towards something, the others would orient on that one, take their cue from it, and a single fixed hunter could pull half a dozen others into a moving pack inside of a minute. That last rule was the one that mattered most. It was the one I built my entire escape around. And it was the one that, 4 days later, I would violate on purpose to save my daughter's life. Here's a question I've never been able to answer for myself, all these months on. And I'll put it to you the way I'd put it to a friend across a table. If you'd been in that store that morning, knowing what I knew, having heard what I'd heard on the radio in the dark, would you have moved at first light while you could still see? Or would you have stayed put and waited for help that the radio was already telling you, in plain language, was never coming? Tell me in the comments, because I have genuinely never decided whether I chose right. And I've had a long time and a lot of quiet nights to think about it. We stayed. That was my second real decision, and I made it against my own gut, which was screaming move. And I made it for one reason, and one reason only, which was that man on the radio saying the line wasn't moving south until sunrise, because they didn't have the people. I reasoned that if the official plan was to eventually come south of the river, then moving toward the river, toward the bridge, might mean moving toward the only place help would ever arrive. And that staying put one more day to see what sunrise brought wasn't cowardice, it was patience. But moving in daylight also meant moving past 15 of those things on a single block, with an 11-year-old whose legs were short and a woman whose knees could give out on a flat sidewalk, and a 70-year-old man. The math didn't close. The math said, wait, gather more, let the situation tell us when to run rather than guessing. So we waited. And I have spent a great deal of energy since making peace with the fact that waiting was also a choice, and that the people who didn't make it out of the South Sector were not, most of them, killed by their cowardice. They were killed by reasonable decisions that happened to be wrong. The situation took its time telling us anything. That second day inside the store was the longest day of my life, and almost nothing happened. And that was the entire horror of it. Time itself became the enemy. We rationed the water, small sips, passing a bottle around, and I watched the level in it go down, and did arithmetic I didn't share. We used a mop bucket in the far back corner for a bathroom, and we all developed the courtesy of looking elsewhere and not commenting. A small dignity we extended to each other in a place that had run out of large ones. Renee slept some. Finally, curled against Carol on the stack of moving blankets, and watching her sleep, watching her chest rise and fall. The small frown she wore even sleeping was the only good thing in that whole gray stretch of hours. Pal mostly sat by the register with the framing hammer across his knees and his phone in his hand. trying his nephew's number every hour on the hour, even though the cell network had degraded from spotty to a single bar to nothing. The call failing before it even rang now. He'd dial and listen, and lower the phone, and sit. And an hour later, he'd dial again. I think he knew. I think he kept dialing anyway, because the dialing was a thing his hands could do. And a man needs a thing his hands can do. And I worked the radio, cranking and listening, building the picture. The picture the radio built that second day was worse than the first. Every fragment a turn of the screw. The Containment broadcast still looped its line about holding at the river, unchanged, patient, awful. But the faster man, the one I'd caught at 3 a.m, came through twice more during the daylight hours. And both times, what he said tightened the noose around us a little more. The first time, mid-afternoon, the heat in the store gone thick and close. He said the South Sector population was non-recoverable. And I had to take that word apart in my head. Non-recoverable. And understand that the word meant us. That we were the population he was talking about. That someone with a map and a radio had drawn a line around the place where my daughter slept and labeled everyone inside it as a loss already taken. He said resources were being concentrated on the North Bank. He said the North Bank could be held. He did not say anything about the South Bank being held, because there was no plan to hold it, only to wall it off. The second time he came through, near dusk, he said a single sentence that I did not tell Carol for 2 more days because I could not make my mouth form it in front of her. He said, "If we can't hold the bridge, we drop the bridge." Drop the bridge. The Commerce Street Bridge. The only crossing for 2 miles. The one way out of the box we were sitting in. The one route I'd been holding in reserve in my mind as our path to wherever help might come from. And these people, whoever they were, with their transmitters and their containment line and their non-recoverable South Sector, were prepared, ready, planning to put that bridge in the river. I didn't sleep that second night either. I sat against the cool concrete of the back wall with the dead radio in my lap. And that sentence going around and around. And I did the cold arithmetic that a man does when he finally accepts all the way down. That nobody is coming. If they were willing to drop the bridge, then the bridge had a clock running on it. And I had no way to read the clock. No way to know if it was hours or days. Staying in the store had stopped being waiting for rescue. It had become waiting to be sealed in permanently, walled off in a sector marked non-recoverable. The store was south of the river. If the bridge went down, we'd be on the wrong side of it forever, in a place the people in charge had already crossed off their map. The decision reversed itself in my mind somewhere in the small hours. Quietly, the way the tide turns. We were not going to wait for help. There was no help. We were going to get across that bridge before they dropped it. On our own, on foot. And I was going to have to find a way to move 4 people, 2 of them slow, through a downtown full of the dead. To reach a crossing that the only authority left alive in this city was actively planning to destroy. It was a worse plan than waiting. It was the only plan that didn't end with us sealed in. I want to pause here and tell you about the exact moment the store stopped being safe. Because it did not happen the way I'd braced myself for. And the way it actually happened taught me the deepest lesson of those 4 days, which is that you can prepare perfectly for the wrong threat. I'd been watching the front, the gate, the door, the glass. I'd planned for a break-in, for one of those things to push through a door left ajar or break the glass to get at us. I had the loaded shotgun staged by the back door and the escape route to the loading dock memorized and walked twice in my head. I had war-gamed the front of that building until I could have run the failure in the dark. I had it covered. It came from the roof. On the third morning, just after dawn, with the light coming gray and thin through the high window, and all of us in that hollow, exhausted state past tiredness. We heard it, a scrabbling, up high. Then a heavy, soft thud, directly above us, in the ceiling, the sound of weight landing on the flat roof. Pell's head came up, and his face went the color of ash, and he said one word, "Skylight," and the bottom dropped out of my stomach, because I remembered now, too late, that I'd seen it the first day and dismissed it. A flat, frosted panel set into the stockroom ceiling, painted half over with years of grime and pigeon mess, the kind of thing your eye slides right past because it's never been important. There was a skylight, and something was on the roof, something that had climbed or fallen or crossed over from the taller building next door. And now it was up there, moving. And it had heard us through the roof, or smelled us, or simply felt the warmth of a building with living things in it. And it was looking for a way down. We froze, all four of us, the way we'd trained ourselves to over 2 nights. We went quieter than the cooler hum. Renee's eyes were huge and fixed on the ceiling. And for a few minutes, it worked. The scrabbling stopped. We heard it standing up there, the weight shifting, one dragging step across the roof, then a long pause. I let myself begin to hope it would lose interest and move on the way they did out on the street, that we were just a warm building, and it would drift off toward the next stimulus. Then Pell's phone rang. He'd kept it on, hour after hour, day after day, trying his nephew. And the network had been dead as a stone for 2 full days. And in 2 days of dead network, not one of us had thought to silence the ringers, because there was nothing left in the world to silence them against. But somewhere out there, for one fragile minute, a single cell tower must have flickered back to life, found power or found purpose, because Pell's phone lit up in his hand and played its full-volume marimba ringtone, that bright, cheerful default tune, into the dead silence of that stockroom. And above us, the thing on the roof went from a slow drag to a frenzy in the space of a single heartbeat. It threw itself at the skylight. The frosted panel cracked, a sharp report. It hit it again, harder, and the grime-painted glass spider-webbed white, and a hand punched through, gray and torn and wrong, raking at the empty air above our heads. Pell fumbled the phone in his shaking hands and dropped it, and it hit the concrete face up and kept ringing. The marimba bouncing off the bare floor and the metal shelves, loud, so loud, and that sound was pulling the creature down through the roof like a fish on a line. And I had maybe 2 seconds to think, so I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged and grabbed the phone off the floor, and I threw it. Hard, overhand, the way my father taught me to throw to home plate 40 years ago, down the full length of the stockroom and through the open doorway into the front of the store, putting it as far from my family as the building allowed. It skittered across the sales floor and lodged somewhere under the front shelving, still ringing, still singing its bright, stupid song. And the thing in the skylight twisted its head toward the new location of the sound, that fast neck snap I'd watched from the gate. And it threw its whole weight after the sound. And the cracked panel gave way completely in a shower of dirty glass, and it fell. It came down hard, a full story, onto a steel shelving unit. And the crash of that, the body and the collapsing shelf, and the cascade of paint cans and boxes hitting the floor, was enormous. A sound that would carry through the walls and out the broken roof and pull every one of those things on the block toward our front door. I knew it the instant it happened. There was nothing to be done about it. The creature got to its feet wrong, all at angles, one leg folding the wrong way and not taking weight. and it dragged itself toward the front of the store, toward the ringing phone, away from us, hunting the sound. For the length of that ringtone, we had a window, and windows close. I made the call. Loading dock, now, all of us, move. And this is the part where I have to tell you what kind of man I am. Because the next 60 seconds defined it for good. The duffel was by the back door, packed and ready, because I'd kept it ready since the first morning by a rule I'd made and refused to break. And that single piece of discipline is the reason my family drew breath that night. We didn't have to gather anything. We didn't have to think. I shouldered the duffel and grabbed the loaded shotgun. Carol took Renee's hand in an iron grip. Pell came up behind with the second shotgun held the way I'd shown him. And I went to the loading door and lifted the iron bar out of its bracket as quietly as a man can lift a heavy iron bar, which is not quietly at all, the metal grinding. And even over the ringing phone, the creature at the front of the store heard it and paused and began, slowly, to turn its ruined head back toward us. The ringtone stopped. The phone's battery died, or the tower dropped again, and the marimba cut off mid-note, and the store fell into total silence, and into that silence the last scrape of the loading bar coming free was the loudest sound in all the world. We went out into the alley, into the early gray, the air outside almost cool after the closeness of the store. The thing inside heard us go and came after fast. That broken-legged drag covering ground faster than anything moving that wrong had a right to, and Pell was last through the door, and the creature reached the doorway just as he cleared it, close enough that I heard the snap of its teeth. Pell hauled the door shut behind him and threw his thin old body against it. And the bar wouldn't drop home because the angle was wrong from the outside. And the creature hit the door from the inside with a boom that shoved Pell's feet skidding back across the alley gravel. I dropped the duffel and threw my shoulder against the steel beside him. And Carol shoved Renee back behind a dumpster and came back and put her own weight on the door. And the three of us held that door against a thing that did not tire, did not weaken, did not feel the pain in its arms the way our arms were already screaming. While my 11-year-old crouched in the alley filth 10 feet away, with both hands over her mouth. And here's the thing I learned about myself in that alley, holding a steel door against the dead while my child watched. And I'm going to say it plainly, because the whole story turns on it. I am a man who will spend everyone else's strength before he spends his own, and who will spend his own down to nothing rather than gamble his family on holding a position that can't be held. Because what I said, when it became clear that we could not both hold the door and get away, when I felt Pell's strength failing beside me and the creature gathering for another lunge, was this. On 3, we let go and we run, all of us. We go together, and we do not stop, no matter what. We do not stop. And I counted, and we let go, all at once, and we ran, and we'd made it to the mouth of the alley before the door even swung fully open behind us. The creature came out and oriented on the 4 moving shapes and gave chase, and we ran south down the alley with it, dragging and lunging after us. And we were faster than it, but only barely. And it followed us for 2 full blocks, making a sound I will not try to describe to you, because some sounds shouldn't be carried in words. And then a noise from a side street. Glass breaking, another of them somewhere. Pulled its snapping head around, and it lost its lock on us, and it peeled off after the new sound. And we kept running until Carol's knees simply would not do it anymore, and she went down to a walk, gasping, her hand pressed white-knuckled to her side. We went to ground in a parking garage on Fulton Street, the multi-level concrete one, climbing the stalled-out ramp to the second level and finding the far corner behind a thick support column where we could watch the ramp without being seen from it. We sat down on the cool, oil-stained concrete in the dark and the smell of motor exhaust and old cigarettes. And we got our breath back by degrees, the four of us, ragged, and I made myself count us. 4. We were still 4. The folding chairs Carol had carried all that way, slung on her shoulder from Commerce Street to this alley, she'd left them behind at the store in the rush for the door. And I almost laughed out loud at the thought that I'd ever believed those chairs might matter. That I'd been glad she kept them. I was wrong to laugh, even silently. You'll see why before the end. We were closer to the bridge now. The garage on Fulton was 2 blocks from the river, and that mattered. Because from the upper level of the structure, through the open gaps in the concrete where a car would normally see out, I could look north over the lower buildings and see the green-painted span of the Commerce Street Bridge in the distance, and beyond it, on the far north bank, I could see vehicles. Not abandoned cars, real vehicles, big, squared-off, military in their shape, parked in a deliberate line with lights on them, and small figures moving with purpose between them. The containment line. It was real, and it was right there, no more than a quarter-mile away across the brown water, the closest thing to safety I'd seen in 3 days. And between us, and it was a bridge that the men on the radio were planning to drop into the river. I want to ask you something here, because it's the question I asked myself in that garage with my family catching their breath around me. We'd just lost our shelter, and we could see the bridge, and we could see living, organized human beings on the far side of it, real people with lights and trucks. A reasonable man might have said, run for it. Run for the bridge right now in daylight while we can see our footing before they drop it. And I almost did. I had my hand on the duffel strap. The only reason I didn't is the thing I saw next through the binoculars. And it tore down everything I thought I understood about what was happening to us. And it changed the entire direction of the rest of this story. I had the binoculars out of the bag, the ones I'd almost left on the shelf, and I was glassing the far bank, trying to read the situation, looking for any sign of how they were processing people, when I saw them do it. The vehicles on the north side, the containment line, the people I had been thinking of, without ever quite saying it to myself, as rescue, as the authority, as the ones who would eventually come south and find us. I watched a small group of people approach the bridge from the south side, our side, from somewhere down in the streets below the far end of the span. A family, it looked like through the shaking lenses, an adult and 3 smaller shapes. And they were waving something, a white shirt or a sheet tied to a stick, holding it up high. And they walked out onto the open deck of the bridge toward the north bank with their free hands raised over their heads. Survivors. People exactly like us. Doing the only sane thing, walking toward the lights and the trucks and the help. And the line on the north bank did not let them across. I watched a single figure step out by the lead vehicle, and I watched the small, bright flash. And a beat later, the length of time it takes sound to cross a quarter-mile of water. The flat, hard crack reached me, where I crouched in the garage, rolling across the river, and the shapes on the bridge went down. All of them. And they did not get up. They had been shot. The line had shot a family walking toward them with their hands up and a white flag. 4 people, 3 of them children. Because the family was coming from the south side, the south sector, the non-recoverable sector, and the line's job, I finally understood, was not to rescue anyone at all. The line's job was to hold the river. Anyone crossing from our side was, to them, not a person to be saved, but a vector to be stopped, a risk to be eliminated, a number to be subtracted. I lowered the binoculars slowly, and I sat down on the cold concrete with my back against the column. And I did not tell Carol what I'd seen. Not right away, because I needed a minute, more than a minute, to take apart in my mind everything I had built my plan and my hope on. The bridge was not an escape route. The bridge was a kill zone with a clear field of fire. The people on the far side were not rescue. They were the precise reason we could never cross. And that cold sentence from the radio, the one I'd been carrying alone for 2 days, if we can't hold the bridge, we drop the bridge, took on a new and complete and terrible clarity. Because now I understood that they would never, under any circumstance, let us across that bridge alive. And the only real question left was whether they would shoot us on the open span the way they'd shot that family, or simply drop the whole structure into the river with us standing on it. Everything reversed in that moment. The whole orientation of my mind. For 3 days, I had been organizing every thought around getting to the bridge. Now the bridge was the single most dangerous place in the entire city. The one place I had to keep my family away from at all costs. And the worst part, the part that hollowed me out as I sat there, with my back to the cold pillar and my family watching my face for an answer I didn't have, was that I had no new destination to replace it. I had been so fixed, so locked onto that crossing, that I'd never seriously planned for the crossing being a trap. South was the sector the authorities had written off, full of the dead, no help coming, ever. North was a line that would shoot us on sight the instant they saw where we'd come from. We were in a box, and I had finally, fully seen all the walls of it at once, and there was no door in any of them. Carol came and sat down beside me on the concrete and put her hand on my knee and asked me, quietly, what I'd seen, because she knew me better than anyone alive. And she knew the exact shape and weight of my silences, and this one frightened her. So I told her. I told her about the family and the white flag and the raised hands and the flash and the sound coming late across the water. And she was quiet for a long time, looking out through the concrete gap at the same bridge. And then she said the thing that became our new plan. The thing that finally broke me out of the bridge entirely and pointed us at the only way out that actually existed in the world. She said, "Then we don't cross where they're watching." And she was right, completely right. And I'd been blind, and I felt the blindness like a physical thing lifting off me, because I'm a man who finds the single obvious route and commits everything to it. And that's a strength when the obvious route is good, and a fatal weakness when it isn't. And the obvious route was the bridge, and the bridge was watched. And the river was not only a bridge. The river was a whole length of water with more than one way across it. Pell knew it. When I said it out loud, working it through the rail crossing, the old freight trestle, his head came up from where he'd been sitting hollow-eyed against the wall. And he said it was still there, downriver maybe a mile, where the old freight line used to cross before the company rerouted everything out past the interchange years ago. He said they'd never torn the trestle out. It was cheaper to leave it, that it was fenced off and rusted and posted with no trespassing signs gone illegible with age, but that the span itself still reached across the water, the timbers and the steel. And he said the thing that mattered most, which was that nobody, not the line on the north bank, not the dead drifting through the south sector, had any reason on earth to be watching a disused freight trestle a mile from downtown. It was a way across that no one expected anyone to use. It was a door in the wall that the people who built the wall had forgotten was there. A mile of downtown streets, through the heart of a sector full of the dead, with an 11-year-old, and a woman whose knees had already failed once today, and a man past 70, to reach a rusted trestle that might or might not still bear our weight. on the pure gamble that the far end of it dropped us somewhere the line wasn't looking. It was a terrible plan, full of holes, depending on luck at half a dozen points. It was the only plan there was. And the clock on the real bridge, the one they might drop at any hour, meant we could not afford to sit safe in this garage and wait. Because if they dropped the Commerce Street Bridge, it wouldn't just close our worst escape route. I had a cold certainty about it that I couldn't fully justify but couldn't shake either. Dropping the bridge would be the line declaring the South Sector officially finished, the final period at the end of the sentence. And I did not want to learn what a containment line does to a sealed sector once containing it is no longer the point. So we moved at dusk. I chose dusk on purpose, deliberately, the way you choose anything in that situation, by trading one bad thing against another. In full dark, we couldn't see the dead until we were on top of them. In full daylight, they could see us from far off. But the gray half-light between, the long blue hour when the street lights should have come on and didn't, gave us the only edge there was. Enough light to read our footing and spot a shape ahead. Little enough light to keep us from being seen across a block. I rigged us for quiet because sound was the enemy. And I went about it like a job, methodically, in the last of the daylight in the garage. I taped down every loose buckle and zipper pull on the duffel with strips of the cloth tape so nothing could jingle. I made everyone empty their pockets onto the concrete and go through them, and set aside anything that clinked, keys, change, a pill bottle of Carol's. And I cut the moving blankets into strips with a box cutter and wrapped the soles of all 4 pairs of shoes where the tread had worn smooth and loud, binding them with more of the paracord and the tape, muffling our steps, the way you'd muffle the feet of a chair you didn't want to scrape across a floor. It took 20 minutes. It was worth every second. And I gave everyone a job because jobs keep people from freezing. And a person with a clear, simple task to focus on doesn't panic the way a person with nothing to do but be afraid does. Carol's job was Renee, to keep her close and keep her moving and never let go of her. Renee's job was to hold the back of Carol's belt with both hands and never let go and never, never raise her voice above a breath. And I made her repeat it back to me, and she did, solemn, terrified, brave. Pell's job was the rear, walking last, watching behind us, with the second loaded shotgun held the way I'd shown him, and to tap me on the shoulder, never call out if he saw something coming up on our back. My job was the front, the route, the calls, the eyes ahead. We went down out of the garage and into the streets. And I'm going to be honest with you that the mile took us close to 3 hours because we moved the way you move through a minefield, which is one careful step at a time. We used the stalled cars for cover, moving from one to the next, crouching behind a fender to study the next stretch before committing to it. We used the alleys where the alleys went our way. We froze, every one of us, going totally still and low. Every single time, something shifted in the gloom ahead. And we waited out the long stretched minutes while a drifting shape crossed an intersection and lurched away into the dark before we breathed again and moved on. Twice we went a full block out of our way to avoid a cluster of them gathered around something on the ground that I made very sure not to look at directly and made very sure Renee didn't see. We were patient in a way I did not know I had in me. Patient past the point of my nerves wanting to scream. And the patience held all the way until we were just 3 blocks from the trestle. And then Renee's foot came down on a broad sheet of broken plate glass that had spilled out of a shattered storefront. And the blanket wrap on her small shoe didn't fully muffle it. And the glass gave that high, sharp crackle under her weight. And the sound carried in the dead-still street the way a cough carries in an empty church. Half a block behind us, a head turned, then the body under it, and then it came. 1 became 3. The fixed one, the one that had locked onto the sound of us, started toward us at that hungry lurch, and the others took their cue from it the way I had watched them do from the gate 3 days before, orienting, committing, falling in. 3 became 5, became more, peeling off side streets and out from between cars, all of them now drawn toward the one thing in the dead city that was moving and warm and making noise, which was us. And we were 3 blocks from the trestle with a pack forming and growing behind us. And we could not outrun it the whole way, not with Carol's knees, not with Renee's short legs already exhausted. And I had a loaded shotgun in my hands, but firing it would do nothing but call every dead thing in the sector down on us at once. This was the moment I had been dreading since the first morning in the store. The moment the math finally ran all the way out. And I had a fraction of a second to do something, anything, or stand there and watch my family go down in the street. This is exactly where the folding chairs would have mattered. The 2 aluminum chairs Carol carried faithfully from Commerce Street for 2 days and then left at the store. Because what I needed in that precise instant was a loud thing I could throw, a noisemaker to fling down a side street and pull the pack off our trail the way the ringtone had pulled the creature through the skylight. Clattering aluminum on pavement would have been perfect. I had left our best decoy behind, and I'd laughed at the thought of needing it. So I used the only thing I had that would make enough noise, and I want you to understand what it cost me to use it. I pulled the crank radio out of the duffel, the radio that had been my lifeline for 4 days. The thing I'd held against my ear through every long black hour, the one window I had into the world outside the box. I cranked the handle hard and fast, 10 furious turns, charging it. I spun the volume to its absolute maximum and turned the dial off any station and into the harshest wall of pure static I could find, that screaming hiss of white noise. And I threw it. I threw it underhand, low and far, down a side street to our left, as far as my arm would send it. And it landed and bounced and came to rest somewhere in the dark, and lay there screaming its static into the night at full volume. And the pack turned. Every one of them, all together, the synchronized snap of all those ruined heads coming around toward the new and louder and steadier sound. The bodies following after. They went for the radio, the loudest, warmest sounding thing in the world. And they left us. We ran the last 3 blocks to the trestle while my radio died somewhere behind us, under a pile of the things that had wanted my daughter. I gave up the radio to save them, and I need you to sit with what that meant, because it wasn't just losing a piece of equipment. The radio was the only window I had into what was actually happening out there. The only voice from outside the box, the only thing in the world that could have warned me when the bridge was finally coming down, or told me whether anyone, anywhere, was still trying. I traded all of that permanently for 3 blocks of running room. And I would do it again without a half second of hesitation. But it meant that from that moment forward, we were deaf. We were moving toward a crossing with no way of knowing what waited on the far side, no way of knowing how much time was left on the bridge clock. No voice left to tell us whether we were running toward open ground or straight into a second line of guns. The trestle was there, exactly as Pell had promised. Fenced with chain link gone orange and flaking with rust, the fence itself half collapsed, where decades of weather had pulled it down and bent it over. We went through the gap where it had fallen, careful of the torn wire. The old rail bed ran out over the black water on a skeleton of weathered timber ties and rusted steel girders. The actual rails long since pulled and sold for scrap on the long stretches, so that what was left was just the ribs of the thing. The ties gapped wide enough in places to look straight down through them at the river moving slow and black and patient below. It was a 1/4 mile across, and it was the most exposed 1/4 mile imaginable. No cover anywhere on it. Nothing but the open span and the empty air and the water below and the two dark banks watching, if anyone was left to watch. I went first, testing each tie before I trusted my weight to it, pressing down with my lead foot, feeling for the give of rot, then committing, then the next. The family came behind me, a single file in the order we'd kept. Carol and Renee linked. Pell last, and we were maybe a third of the way out across the open water, fully committed now with the city glowing a faint sick orange behind us where things had begun to burn, and the north bank a low dark line ahead, when the bridge went. Not our trestle, the Commerce Street Bridge, a mile upriver, behind and to our right. We were out in the open over the middle of the water when it happened, exposed under the last of the light. And so we saw all of it, every part. First, a series of flashes running along the length of the green span, evenly spaced, deliberate. The way a man spaces things when he means to do a job correctly and has been trained to do it. Then the sound reached us. A string of hard cracks running so close together they smeared into one long rolling peal of thunder that crossed the water and hit us in the chest like a flat hand. And then, the slow, impossible, almost graceful sight of that entire bridge sagging in its middle, the deck buckling and folding, and going down into the river in great dark pieces, throwing up a wall of white water that we felt a full second later as a sudden cool gust of wind on our faces, a mile away. They had dropped the bridge. The south sector was officially, finally over, sealed, finished. And we were standing on a rusted freight trestle in the exact middle of the river, the only living things crossing the water in a city that had just slammed its last door shut. The flash and the long roll of that explosion did something I should have predicted and didn't. It pulled the dead. On the south bank behind us, the bank we'd just left, shapes began appearing at the fence line and along the riverbank. Dozens of them, all drawn by the enormous sound, the way a single thrown radio had drawn 5 of them, multiplied. And some of them found the same fallen gap in the fence that we had. And some of them came out onto the trestle after us, drawn now by the only movement left in their narrowing world, which was 4 small shapes strung out across the open span. They came onto the gapped ties, and here is the cruel mercy of it. The dead do not test their footing. They do not press down with a lead foot and feel for rot. They do not trust their weight to each board one at a time. They simply come, all in a rush. And the first one of them came too fast, and its foot dropped clean through a wide gap between ties, and it pitched forward and fell, turning, down into the black water below, and was gone without a sound. But the next one came, and the next. And most of them made it further than the first, because the trestle was crowded enough now that they fell into each other and caught on each other, instead of through the gaps, a clotting mass of them coming out onto the span. We ran. We abandoned the careful testing of every tie, because careful was going to get us caught and dragged down. And we ran across the gapped ties in the failing light over the moving water with the dead pouring onto the span behind us. And that was the longest stretch of my life. Longer than the second day in the store. Longer than holding the door. Longer than anything before or since. Renee fell once, her small foot finding a gap, dropping through to the hip. And the cry started up out of her. And Carol had her by the upper arm before she could go through, hauled her up bodily, set her back on her feet, and kept her moving, without breaking stride. And I have never in my life been more grateful for anything than I was for my wife's grip in that second. Pell, behind all of us, was the slowest, and he knew it, the way he'd known it all along. And I heard his steps falter and stop, and I turned and seined, and he was standing on the ties facing back the way we'd all come. his thin shoulders squared, the second shotgun up to his cheek, and he looked at me down the length of the span over the heads of his family. And he said, loud enough now that loud no longer mattered, "Get her across, Marcus. I'll hold the bridge." I think about Pell holding the bridge more than I think about almost anything else from those 4 days. He was a 70-year-old man who had opened his store on a parade morning because he didn't trust anyone else to count his drawer. He had let 3 strangers in out of a screaming street when his own nephew, his blood, had told him to open the door for no one. He had carried a shotgun he barely knew how to fire across a mile of dead streets and never once complained. And now, he stood on that rusted trestle, and he fired into the things coming after us. The shotguns roar enormous in the dark over the water, and the muzzle flash and the thunder of it pulled even more of them out onto the span, exactly as he must have known it would, because that was the whole point. He was making himself the loudest, warmest thing on that bridge, so that we would not be. The span filled and crowded with the dead pressing toward his gun. And the trestle, 80 years old, abandoned, rusted, never built to hold a crowd at the best of times, began to give beneath them. We were across. The 3 of us reached the north bank and went down the steep, weed-choked embankment into the brush and the dark. And I turned to look back across the water, and I saw the middle of the trestle, the section crowded thick with the dead, and with one thin old man standing among them, still firing, lean and twist and come apart, the ancient timbers letting go all at once, with a sound like the whole world tearing, and the entire center section dropped away into the black river and took everything standing on it down into the dark. The sound of it reached us a moment later. A vast, splintering crash and the heavy slap of water. And then the river was just the river again, moving black and slow under the last gray of the dusk. And the trestle was a broken thing with its whole middle gone, a stub reaching out from each bank toward nothing. And Pell was not on either side of it. He had held the bridge. He had given us the far bank with the last thing he had to give, which was his own weight added to the count that finally broke it. And there was no time to grieve him, none, because we were on the north bank now, in the territory of the line, the people who had shot a family carrying a white flag in cold blood that same afternoon. And I had to assume, instantly, that they had heard the trestle collapse and the shotgun fire that preceded it and would come to investigate the noise. The line had been drawn to hold the river. A freight trestle going down a mile from their main crossing, with gunfire, was exactly the kind of thing they would come to look at. And I had 2 people left to keep alive. No radio to warn me of anything, almost no water, no shelter, no map of the north bank, and no plan passed to get across, because get across had been the entire plan, the whole of it. And now we were across, and I had nothing left in the chamber. We went to ground in the thick brush along the top of the north embankment, and we lay flat, and we waited, and we listened. My arm over Renee, Carol pressed against my other side, all 3 of us breathing through our mouths to stay quiet. And what I had feared came true within minutes. There were lights moving along the bank toward us from the direction of downtown, sweeping, methodical. And there were voices, real human voices calling to each other. And the specific, unmistakable sounds of people who are armed and organized and moving in a line to search ground. The line had come to see what had dropped the trestle. And I had to decide. Lying in the wet brush in the dark with my wife and my daughter pressed against me. Whether to hide from the only other living people for miles in any direction, or to stand up and reveal us to people I had watched, with my own eyes through good binoculars, gunned down 3 children and their parent that very afternoon for the crime of coming from the wrong side of the water. Here's the thing that made it impossible. that made it a true trap with teeth on both sides. We could not survive on the North Bank on our own. I knew it the way I knew my own name. We didn't know an inch of the territory, had no idea what was safe or held or overrun. We had perhaps a swallow of water left between the three of us. We had no shelter, and the night was getting cold off the river, and the dawn, when it came, would strip away the brush cover that was the only thing hiding us. Hiding from the line meant dying slower, dying tomorrow or the day after instead of tonight. But revealing ourselves to them meant trusting people who had demonstrated, beyond any argument, that they would treat anyone from the South Bank as a thing to be eliminated rather than a person to be saved. And we were, unmistakably, from the South Bank. We were soaked to the waist from the spray and the crossing. We were filthy from 4 days in the box. We had the look of exactly the people they had spent all day shooting. I made the last call. And I'll tell you straight that it's the one I'm least sure of. Less sure than the store, less sure than the radio, less sure than any decision in those 4 days. And I've gone over it more times than I can count. I decided we would not approach them as survivors begging to be let through, because I had seen with absolute clarity what happened to those. I decided instead to approach them as the one thing they might actually want and not already have, which was information, because the single card I held that the dead family on the bridge had not held was that I had been inside the South Sector for 4 days, and I'd watched the dead, studied them, learned their rules, how they hunted and what set them off, and how a pack formed and broke. And a containment line that had just dropped a bridge and was clearly about to expand its operations might value a living man who could tell them how the enemy actually behaved more than it valued the simple administrative safety of shooting one more refugee. I would make myself worth more alive than dead. It was the only currency I had. It was a gamble built entirely on a cold reading of cold people. A bet that the men who'd shot the family were not monsters, but bureaucrats of survival, men doing terrible arithmetic, and that I could change the arithmetic. I told Carol and Renee to stay flat in the brush, hidden no matter what they heard, no matter what happened to me, and not to come out, not for anything, unless I called them by Renee's middle name, Adais, a word we would never in 1,000 years use by accident. Carol gripped my wrist hard and didn't argue, because she understood the math too. And then I did the hardest physical thing I have ever done, which was to stand up, slowly, deliberately, out of safe cover, with my hands open and empty and held high over my head, and step out of the brush into the white sweep of the line's lamps, and say, in the steadiest voice I could find in myself, the only thing I had to bargain with. I came across from the south. I was inside there 4 days. I know how they move, how they hunt, what draws them. I'll tell you everything I learned, but I'm not telling you one word of it until my family is safe. The lamp swung onto me and pinned me, white and blinding. I couldn't see the men behind them, could only see the lights and hear. All around the edges of the brightness, the small, hard sounds of people deciding whether to shoot, the shift of boots, the readying of weapons. A low word passed between them. It went on a long time, far longer than holding the door, longer than the trestle. The longest few seconds of my life, standing blind, in that light, with my hands up, and my family in the brush behind me. And then a voice came out of the dark behind the lamps, a woman's voice. The first woman's voice I'd heard since the mother on the rooftop, on the dying radio days before. And it was flat and bone-tired. The voice of a person who had been making unbearable decisions all day long, and was looking, hoping, for any reason at all, not to have to make one more of them. She said, "What family?" And I knew, in the exact way she said those 2 words, in that flat, exhausted reaching tone, that we were going to live. Not because these were good people. I had watched that afternoon what these people would do. We were going to live because I had made myself worth more to them breathing than dead. And that, in the world the broadcast had made out of our city in a single morning, was the only kind of safety left to anyone. They took us in. They put the three of us in the back of one of the squared-off vehicles, and they kept their distance and their weapons ready the whole time. And they watched us, all of us, for the fever, for any bite or scratch, for any sign at all, for 2 full days in a quarantine tent on the North Bank, fed and watered but never trusted, never touched without gloves. And in those 2 days, I told them everything I knew. Told it to the woman whose voice had said what family, whose name was Major Okafor, who had hard eyes and a way of going very still while she listened. I told her how the dead hunted by sound above all else. I told her about the pack behavior, the way a single fixed hunter would pull the others into a moving group within a minute, and that the corollary was you could pull a whole pack off your trail with one louder sound thrown somewhere else, that I had done it myself with a radio. I told her they couldn't work a doorknob but would shove through anything ajar, that they would break glass for warm prey, that they came up through roofs and over rooftops, and you could not only watch the doors. I told her they didn't test their footing, didn't feel pain, didn't tire. She wrote all of it down in a small notebook, page after page, and asked me to go back over the pack behavior twice. On the 3rd day, she came to the tent herself and told me, in that same flat voice, but with something different underneath it now, that the information had already saved 2 of her people that morning at the new line they were pushing inland, that they'd used the sound decoy trick to pull a pack off a stranded patrol, and that the 3 of us had cleared quarantine. No fever, no sign. We were, in the dry language of the line, recovered, cleared, alive, on the right side of the river, behind the wall instead of inside it. She also told me, because I asked her directly, and she turned out to be the kind of person who answered direct questions with the truth, even when the truth cost her something, that the order to fire on the family on the Commerce Street Bridge that afternoon had been hers. She had given it, she said, because the man at the front of that family had been bitten, and she could see it through her own binoculars even though his children walking beside him could not. The wound on his forearm, the gray creeping up from it, the sweat of the turning fever on him, and that holding the line, drawing it hard and absolute at the river, had been the only thing standing between a sealed city and a lost region, a lost state. I don't know if that was true about the bite. I will never know. I have decided, by an act of will, to believe it. To believe she saw what she said she saw, because the alternative is a thing I cannot carry along with everything else I'm already carrying. And a man can only carry so much before his legs go out from under him. We live on the North Bank now, the 3 of us, in the long gray after. The south sector is still dark across the water, no lights over there at night. The broken bridge a green stub reaching out from each shore toward an empty middle. The old freight trestle a rusted skeleton with its center gone. Both of them monuments now to the day the city closed. Renee doesn't talk about the store, or the radio, or Pell, or the things she saw between her fingers in the alley. The counselors the line eventually set up say not to push her, and we don't. But sometimes at dusk, in that gray-blue half-light we crossed the trestle in, she goes very still wherever she's standing, and her hand drifts back and finds the back of my belt and takes hold of it with both small fingers the way she did on Commerce Street, without seeming to know she's doing it at all. And I let her hold on, and I don't say a word, and I don't move, because some things you hold on to without ever naming them out loud, and her holding my belt is one of them. And Pell standing on that bridge is another. I think a great deal about the broadcast that cut in over the parade that morning. The synthetic voice that got 3 words into telling us what was coming, and then choked on the word, and reset, and tried again, and choked again. I've decided, over all these quiet nights, that the machine couldn't say it, because no machine is built to say a thing like that. Not to 3,000 people sitting in folding chairs on a warm June morning with watermelon in the cooler and church fans in their hands, waiting for the horses to come around the corner. The word it couldn't finish was the truest word in the world that morning. And the machine's failure spared us from hearing it for exactly 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, while everyone else sat still and reasonable and waited for an explanation, I stood up. And because I stood up before I was sure I needed to, we lived. If you've made it all the way through this with me, I want to thank you for sitting with it. The whole long telling of it. I don't have a clean lesson to leave you with, because there wasn't one out there in any of it. No tidy moral, no reason the good ones lived and the good ones died. Because Pell was as good a man as I have ever known, and the river has him. But I'll tell you the one thing I know for certain now. The one thing those 4 days carved into me. The safest place is never the place with the strongest walls. It's the place you have already decided to leave before you are forced to. A man who waits to move until the moment he's made to move has already lost, because by then the choosing is over and only the running is left. The only reason my wife and my daughter are sleeping under a roof tonight, with the river sound coming soft through the window, is that on a warm June morning, with the music still dying out of the speakers and everyone around me telling themselves it was a glitch, I stood up before anyone else did. And I'd like to know, since you've stayed with me to the very end of it, would you have stood up that early, on nothing but a feeling and a dead feed, and a single word that got cut off mid-syllable? Because most of the good people in those chairs didn't. And the only thing that separated them from us, in the end, was 4 seconds and a willingness to move toward the truck before I was sure I needed to. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. And tell me honestly whether you think you'd have stood up. I read every one of them. It's quiet on the North Bank after dark. Quiet enough to hear the water. And the comments are the closest thing I've got, most nights, to a voice on a dead channel that finally, after all that cranking in the dark, answers back.